You are in the Rant Lounge, which is where for $5 I will rant about a topic of your choice. Click the link in the description to request a rant. This one comes from The True Blur, and he writes, Rant about action game bosses. So, one idea that I talk a lot about with action games is this concept of styling on the enemies versus styling on the health bar. Picture Dark Souls. Picture a game like that where in a boss fight you're usually faced with this big blob, this big damage sponge that is not responsive to your attacks at all. The only thing it's really responding to realistically is your position in the space, right? It's tracking you, it's choosing attacks based on distance. That's sort of cool, I guess. But really, all you were doing is mashing R1, hitting R1, wailing on the health bar, and dodging when you need to, dodging when an attack is incoming, or defending in some other kind of way. And I would argue that this is very dry. You're not really making a lot of decisions. And I'm going to go into more as we go, but if you go back to the origin point of melee single-player action games, of melee fighting in single-player games, obviously you have to talk about beat-em-ups. And the main thing that beat-em-ups do is to spice this dynamic up a little bit, is they give attacks functions beyond just damaging the enemy. And, you have, on a very basic level, you have hit stun, which temporarily freezes the enemy in place. You have throws, which can reposition the enemy. You have knockdowns, which create a little break in the fights, but then also can lead to different things. Maybe the enemy is invulnerable while they're knocked down, and while they get up, they can prepare another attack. That can lead to different dynamics. But then the reason any of that even matters, and the reason that any of that makes sense or is relevant to the player, is because you're always dealing with crowds. It's very uncommon in these games to have any kind of situation where you're not fighting more than a single enemy. Because guess what? If you translated those exact mechanics to a 1v1 boss fight, it still wouldn't be that much more exciting than Dark Souls, right? Like, again, imagine I do my combo, every single hit does a little hit stun, and then at the end of the combo I knock them down, and then while they're knocked down, they get their one chance to attack, blah, blah, blah. The astute viewer may be thinking, this sounds sort of like Virgil in DMC3. And I would argue, yeah, for those reasons, it's not an exemplary fight like Virgil 2 or Virgil 1. It's fine, it's cool, but yeah. So why have bosses in the first place if seemingly it's so much harder to design a compelling loop around that? And when I mention Virgil, it just makes the immediate thing you're thinking is like, well, it just makes a lot of emotional sense, right? Virgil is just cool. It feels climactic to fight this character. It's much easier to project meaning onto a single antagonist or anything rather than just a random mooks that you're fighting. I mean, think about an action movie, right? Obviously, like John Wick or whatever, going through a shit ton of bad guys, and then you get to the actual thing you want to get to. Language. That just makes for very logical, emotional pacing. It just feels right. And especially in a gamey context, you want this like capstone to all the challenges you faced up to that point. I don't think there's really a big intellectual reason for it. I think it just feels right. I wouldn't even say this is necessarily a storytelling thing, because you might not give a shit about the story, and it's still emotionally kind of relevant. It's still emotionally satisfying. Think about a game like God Hand, where obviously you don't fucking care what's going on in the cutscenes, but it's still cool that you're fighting this guy called Devil Hand, and he has sunglasses. So, as much as it's inherently maybe not that compatible with traditional action game mechanics, it's still something you have a hard time avoiding. Now, how do you make a boss fight compelling? How do you make a 1v1 fight of this kind of nature compelling? My favorite set of 1v1 fights in a traditional action game is Sifu. And the secret sauce of that game to me is its set of defensive mechanics, where you have dodges, you have weaves, you have blocks, you have parries, and none of these things are necessarily prescribed. Basically, anything works on anything. You also have hitbox altering moves that allow you to sort of slip past attacks and still get hits in, which is insanely cool. And a ton of the bosses are really designed to test that, to test the limits of that. So when I see the boss behave in a certain way, when I see them throw out a specific attack, I might have some ideas of, okay, this is the best way to respond to the situation, but then maybe this is really difficult to execute, or maybe the position that I'm in the space, or maybe the amount of stamina that I have just makes this a risk not worth taking. So I should consider alternative options. I think the fact that all of these universal mechanics are tied together by the stamina system sort of necessarily means that it's constantly relevant. It's always relevant. If I have a 1v1 fight like that, I probably want some way of constant action. I don't want a situation where the boss is just backing off or knocked down or whatever. I want them to stay aggressive the whole time, because, again, there's no other enemies to provide that. I need the boss to provide that. And then when that's the case, you need some way of interacting with them that's not just attacking or dodging. Again, if you look at Sifu's approach, it makes sense that they gave the defensive tools all these inherent functions. That, again, weaving heals your stamina, and the parrying does stamina damage. It's really simple when you think about it, but I haven't really seen any other game do it this well. Not the deepest thing ever, but it's really cool. I guess the other big obvious one is Monster Hunter, where they made the dodge not very generous. So this means, number one, the enemy doesn't have to track you as aggressively, and it just feels a little more natural. The enemy doesn't have to track you so aggressively, and it's still a threat, right? Because your dodge is not all powerful. But then also, your positioning matters, and your position matters also in the sense that the monster has, where you hit the monster has implications, right? You can hit the tail, you can hit the fleshy parts, you can hit armored parts, and they even drop like different materials if you're fucking into that. Yeah. I think I want more games to kind of explore what Sifu did. I think we need to get away. I think Bayonetta is another example. Yeah, Bayonetta is interesting because obviously John is like the best boss fight of all time. And that also follows this principle of just constant fucking aggression. But then I think it's, in Bayonetta's case, it's not really, I mean, the defensive tools in Bayonetta are really interesting, sort of the way they interact with your offense. Because you kind of need to care about how, I don't want to get super deep into it, right? But you need to care about how you dodge to enable stronger attacks in the future. And then that will usually allow you to interrupt whatever John is doing. Yeah, I hope this, I've had a hard time sort of organizing my thoughts on this. Obviously a really big, complicated topic, but I hope this was useful.